It's Friday, the 28th of April, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. On the programme this week, with British nationals trapped by fighting in Sudan, MPs debate how to rescue them.
What they need to hear is a clear plan on how the government will support those still in danger, how they will communicate with them and when.
She asked me about the British nationals who are trapped in Khartoum and more widely in Sudan, and I can tell her that we are looking at every single possible option for extracting them.
The government's illegal migration bill is back in the Commons, but some of their own MPs have concerns.
It will give the traffickers another weapon to hold people in that slavery and exploitation, because it would be very easy to say to them, don't even think about trying to escape.
The Prime Minister and Labour leader clash over the cost of living at PMQs.
How on earth does he think his low-growth, high-tax economy is working for working people?
Almost 8 million households receiving direct support from this Conservative government. We are supporting working people.
And in Wales, an apology for people forced to have their babies adopted in the past.
Many of those affected find it extremely difficult to open up and talk about the lifelong heartbreak they've kept to themselves.
All that coming up, but let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran and events in Sudan. Since fighting broke out between rival military factions 2 weeks ago, there's been a lot of concern for UK nationals trapped in the country. And on Monday, there was a ministerial statement on the situation there. Sean, what happened?
Well, MPs arrived back at Westminster after the weekend to discover that the situation in Sudan had deteriorated. And over the weekend, the UK government had taken the decision to evacuate its diplomats and their families. So that's the embassy staff had left the country. So a lot of MPs had constituents who are still in Sudan, but they also had questions about why the government had taken this decision, and the obvious question, what were they going to do next to help those British nationals who were still trapped in Khartoum and in other parts of the country. It's thought there are about 4,000 UK nationals in the country, and of that, perhaps 2,000 were looking to escape. So the Africa Minister, Andrew Mitchell, from the Foreign Office, came to MPs to make a statement and update MPs on the situation in Sudan and face their questions about what might happen next.
The safety and security of British nationals continues to be our utmost priority. Our ability to support British nationals has not been impacted by the relocation of British embassy staff. The evacuation team will continue to operate from a neighbouring country alongside the Foreign Office in London. Movement around the capital remains extremely dangerous, and no evacuation option comes without grave risk to life.
Our relief at the success of this mission doesn't alleviate our concern for the several thousand British nationals still trapped in Sudan amid growing violence. And many will be frightened and desperate to leave. What they need to hear is a clear plan on how the government will support those still in danger, how they will communicate with them and when.
She asked me about the British nationals who are trapped in Khartoum and more widely in Sudan. And I can tell her that we are looking at every single possible option for extracting them. And she acknowledged that this was a very complex area. I can only say to her that it certainly was.
The central tenet of the contract between British nationals and their government, or indeed the nation-state, is that of trust. And trust at this point is being stretched. Trust that we will evacuate them and get them to a place of safety when they are in need. If, however, we are following the US policy of non-evacuation or limited evacuation, we must have the moral courage to tell our British nationals that that is the case, because they are running out of food, they are running out of water, electricity and internet signal, Some are killing their pets because they know they can no longer feed them.
Whilst Khartoum, the capital, is very much dangerous, the vast country, the rest of it, is desolate, and adds together the elite forces of the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden. That's a formidable elite force that could mimic what the United Nations is doing in using and protecting a land corridor to get the thousands of expats and internationals from the capital, indeed, to Port Sudan and to safety.
The British government has supported many governments in developing countries over the years with education on the civil oversight of defence. And this includes educating senior military personnel in developing countries as part of our programme of defence diplomacy. Last year, a Liberal Democrat question served to find that no training has been provided by the MOD to counterparts in Sudan since 2020 because it would be regarded as military aid. Does he think education on the civil oversight of defence is worth categorising separately from military aid in those cases where perhaps a partner government might be considering receiving it?
Through the pooled funding arrangements that we have, often that sort of work with the military can take place. But I can tell him why he got the answer last year about Sudan. It was because all our efforts were bent to trying to support the peace process and the negotiations that were going on in order to achieve a return to civilian rule.
And Sean, the following day, the airlift of UK nationals was announced.
Yes, this is a situation that has developed through the week. We've been told that ministers, including the Prime Minister, have been having these emergency so-called COBRA meetings. We then learnt, within a few hours really of that statement, that 120 British troops were at the airfield in Khartoum and that they were going to be organising the airlifting out of British nationals. We learnt that Royal Marines were at Port Sudan, 500 miles away from the Sudanese capital, looking at other options. And we were then told that British nationals had been told they could make their way to the airfield. But throughout all of this, there have been problems with communication. We heard from ministers saying that at times the internet in Sudan was just 2% and they were having difficulties. And also the nationals who were going, the British citizens who were going to the airfield were told to make their own way there. And all throughout this, ministers were saying that people were having to travel at their own risk. So they have faced questions throughout the week about how this operation is going on. And of course, all of this has been contingent upon the ceasefire between the fighting factions in the capital and elsewhere holding.
But at Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, the focus was on the cost of living again, wasn't it? And it got quite feisty and personal. What happened? Yes, well, there was, I mean, to be fair to the leaders, there was a sort of sober enough start where they talked about Sudan in general terms, but they quickly got personal. And this is something that we saw developing last week, actually, that there's a bit of personal needle between the two. We've obviously got local elections coming up, so it's an opportunity for them to perhaps try out a few slogans or a few jibes. And we basically saw a discussion that became personal, beginning with really a focus on the economy and the cost of living. And the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who always gets the opportunity to kick off these exchanges, of course, very keen to quote comments that had been made by the former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne when he appeared before a House of Lords committee.
Mr Speaker, yesterday George Osborne said that the Tory party's handling of the economy makes them vandals. He's right, isn't he?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr Speaker, while we're in the business of quoting former Chancellors and Shadow Chancellors, I don't know if he saw the remarks from a former Labour Shadow Chancellor yesterday, who said our country had faced 4 once-in-a-century shocks, threats to our economy, and the fact that we've come through it is a triumph, Mr Speaker.
Well, that former Chancellor not only said there were a bunch of Tory vandals, he also said there was a self-induced financial crisis on the country. That's those vandals. And they like to pretend that it was all just 1 week of madness last autumn. But the truth is, it's been 13 years of failure. Real wages, the money in people's pockets, have fallen by £1,600 per household. £1,600. The Prime Minister's response? To impose 24 Tory tax rises in 3 years. 24. How on earth does he think his low-growth, high-tax economy is working for working people?
Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, because of the action that we've taken on the national living wage at record levels, on pension, on universal credit, and the generous cost of living payments. Just yesterday, Mr. Speaker, almost 8 million households receiving direct support from this Conservative government. We are supporting working people. But just this week, Mr. Speaker, in the other place, we've seen his party side with protesters and with picketers. He should actually try backing working people.
Lost £1,600 worse off. Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely fascinated to know, does he really think that everything's fine, or is he just clueless about life outside of his bubble?
Mr. Speaker, because of the actions that we have taken, well, let's just go over it. A single mother working full-time on the national living wage this year will get £1,300 more support from this government. A working couple on low income with 2 children will get £1,800, Mr. Speaker. That's what delivering for working Britain looks like. But if he has any actual ideas for the economy, he should say so, because all I hear from the party opposite, it's more spending, more borrowing, higher inflation, higher interest rates. It's the same old Labour Party.
This is Mr. 24 tax rises. And I've never heard anything so out of touch as the answer that he has just given. And it's not just his refusal to take any responsibility for the damage they've done, the crashed economy, the hit to living standards. It's also he refuses to take the action that's needed. He could stop the handouts he's giving to oil and gas giants. He could scrap his beloved non-dom status. He could put that money back in the hands of working people and get the NHS back on its feet. That's what a Labour government would do. Why doesn't he?
Mr. Speaker, the record was clear. Look at it right now. Record numbers of people in work, Mr. Speaker. Record numbers of people in work. Inequality lower. The number of people in poverty lower. Those in low pay, the lowest numbers on record, Mr. Speaker. He talks about this non-dom thing. I think he's already spent the money that he claims he'd raised on 5 different things, Mr. Speaker, because it's the same old Labour Party. They're always running out of other people's money.
Mr. Speaker, to be clear, and I think everyone in the House is aware of this, children in Sudan are already dying. Now, whether it's a Tory slogan to stop the boats or a Labour slogan to stop small boats, we need some more humanity in this debate, rather than the race to the bottom which we see here today. So can I ask the Prime Minister, now that he has confirmed that there is no safe and legal route, will he therefore confirm that it would be his government's intention to detain and deport a child refugee who flees Sudan and comes to the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, because of the efforts of our aid teams, we've invested almost £250 million in humanitarian support in Sudan over the past 5 years. And Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman does it always, but actually this country has a proud record of compassionately supporting those who need our assistance. Just over the last few years, we have welcomed almost 500,000 vulnerable people to our country, including many children, and it's that compassion that we want to make sure we continue, Mr. Speaker.
We saw the SNP's Westminster leader there, Stephen Flynn, referring to the government's illegal migration bill, which was debated in the Commons a couple of hours after PMQs.
Yes, that's right, Ben. And this is a hugely controversial piece of legislation. The idea is it will deliver on the promise that Rishi Sunak made at the start of the year, that the government will stop people crossing the channel in small boats. Now, of course, one of the controversial proposals is that somebody who arrives in the UK through what will be called illegal means will face the prospect of being sent to a third country, probably Rwanda. Now, this has been a long debate in the Commons, and this was the final stage of it. So this was an opportunity for people to discuss some amendments, some proposals they'd come up with, some had come from the government. But what was interesting about this debate was that there was still unhappiness and opposition to the proposals, and some of it came from senior Conservatives.
A sovereign state must have control of its own borders. We quite properly have an immigration system that determines who can come to the UK lawfully, but the people of this country are rightly frustrated if a self-selected group of individuals can circumvent those controls by paying people smugglers to ferry them across the Channel on a small boat.
Asking the House to believe that it would act as a pull factor, that people will come here on the basis of the possibility that we might pass an amendment giving asylum seekers the right to work. Because if that's the Minister's case, even by his standards, it's particularly poor.
It's important that we get this bill right. I do understand the complexity of the legal and operational challenges that we face. In enacting this legislation, we must be alert to those who will seek to use every possible tactic to thwart and frustrate the operation of the Act. So since introduction, we've continued to examine how to make the bill as robust as possible, as well as reflecting on the debates in committee last month.
What happens, Minister, if a 16-year-old in Moldova is told that she's got a job in a restaurant in Belfast? She's provided with a Romanian passport. She comes across here on an aeroplane with false documents. But when she gets to Belfast, she doesn't get a job. She's put in a terraced house, forced into prostitution. The lock is on the outside of the bedroom. And she's effectively repeatedly raped. The police break that ring, rescue her. At the moment, she gets protection. She gets looked after. She's helped in the prosecution. This bill changes that. And please tell me why.
If somebody was in exactly the position that he raised, then they should, of course, go to the law enforcement authorities. And at that point, the provision in the bill, the safeguard that we put in the bill would apply.
Isn't, in fact, my right honourable friend, in effect asking this House to give legislative sanction to at least the possibility that a Minister of the Crown will deliberately disobey the international law obligations of this country?
We take our treaty obligations very seriously, and the Minister exercising this discretion would have to do so.
Every single measure that ministers announce turns out to either be an expensive and unworkable headline-chasing gimmick or a policy that succeeds only in making things worse, or indeed both. And in the case of this legislative sham that we're debating today, this bigger backlog bill, it is definitely both.
The government will be ensuring that more people will stay enslaved and in exploitation as a result of this bill, because it will give the slave drivers, it will give the traffickers another weapon to hold people in that slavery and exploitation, because it will be very easy to say to them, don't even think about trying to escape from the misery of your life, from the suffering we are subjecting you to, because all the UK government will do is send you away and probably send you to Rwanda.
And the bill passed its final stages in the Commons and now goes to the House of Lords. Thanks, Sean. We'll be back with you shortly for more from Westminster. Let's find out what's been happening in the Scottish Parliament now. Our reporter, Jenny Davidson, is there. Jenny, Nicola Sturgeon was back at Holyrood this week for the first time since the arrest of her husband, the former SNP Chief Executive Peter Murrell, and she spoke to journalists outside the chamber. What did she have to say?
Well, that's right, yes. Nicola Sturgeon was back at Holyrood for the first time since before the Easter break, actually. Now, of course, as you say, 3 weeks ago, her husband, Peter Murrell, was arrested and released without charge. Since then, the SNP's now former Treasurer, Colin Beattie, also arrested and released without charge, both in relation to a police investigation into the SNP's finances. Alongside that, there's been the issue of the SNP's auditors having resigned months ago and their struggle to find replacements. Now, on her way into the chamber, Nicola Sturgeon stopped to give a brief statement to journalists and answer some of the questions and the speculation around issues such as, had she been questioned by police, and did she stand down when she did because she knew what was about to happen?
I think fair to say this is not the easiest time. I'm not saying that for sympathy, it is what it is. But I'm determined to get on with the job that I am doing. I'm working from home, have been working from home. You've all got colleagues outside my house, so you probably know that. I've been in my constituency. It's good to be back here in Parliament, and I'm going to get on with representing my constituents.
Have you been questioned by the police yet?
No.
Do you expect to be questioned
As
by
a matter,
the police?
I'm not going to get into any aspect of the police investigation.
A lot of your supporters really want to know what is really happening at the moment.
Look, one of the frustrating things just now, and I'm not complaining about this, I understand the process that is underway, but one of the frustrating aspects of that is that I'm not able to give my version of what is going on just now. Hopefully the time will come when I can do that. So I appreciate the concern, I appreciate the frustration, but that is the nature of the process that is underway right now.
Do you owe Humza Yousaf an apology for the state you've handed the party to him in?
I think Humza's doing, in very, very difficult circumstances, an outstanding job. I have become ever more convinced, and I was already convinced of this, that he's going to be a very fine First Minister. I understand the view that some people might have, that I knew this was all about to unfold and that's why I walked away. Nothing could be further from the truth. I could not have anticipated in my worst nightmares what would have unfolded over the past few weeks. I believe the SNP, notwithstanding the real difficulties that surrounds the party just now, is in good shape.
Nicola Sturgeon looking quite emotional there. Now, because of that ongoing police investigation, it may be some time before she gets her wish to be able to give her side of the story.
And Jenny, at First Minister's questions, Humza Yousaf was asked about an increase in the number of rape cases reported to Police Scotland. And that ties into some major changes to the Scottish justice system being proposed by the Scottish Government, doesn't it?
That's right, yes. He was asked about the number of reported rape cases reaching the highest level for 6 years. And that ties into some new legislation that was published by the Scottish Government this week, the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill, which is proposing really quite major changes across the justice system, but particularly in relation to sexual crimes. One of the major ones is the dropping of a strange anomaly that Scotland has a third verdict of not proven, which legally means the same as not guilty, but there's concerns that that's probably not the way that it's understood by juries and the public. That's going. Changes to the size of juries, to the majority needed for a verdict, the creation of a new specialist court for sexual offences, and also the introduction of automatic anonymity for victims of sexual offences, something that exists across the rest of the UK but not currently in Scotland.
The real problem, presiding officer, is that the entire system from end to end is letting victims of crime down, from the initial reporting experience to the lengthy delays in getting trials to come to pass, up to 4 years in some cases. It's horrendous. The court experience itself is re-traumatising, and even if, and it is an if, a conviction is secured, and we all know that conversion rates are notoriously low in Scotland, the victim of that crime faces the injustice of watching the perpetrator dished out a lenient sentence relative to the gravity of the crime that was committed against that victim. So what I would say to the First Minister, as a former Justice Secretary himself, is if he will make a personal commitment today to those victims of this horrific crime, that he will undertake a root and branch review of how this country handles and processes cases of rape.
In terms of a few of the points that Jamie Green raises, and I think he is absolutely right to raise them, that is the entire purpose, of course, of the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill that has been introduced. It is putting victims and witnesses at the heart of our justice system. I have the great pleasure of meeting a number of families and activists, campaigners, victims, witnesses, survivors yesterday at a meeting to discuss the bill. I say great pleasure because out of the most horrific circumstances and enormous tragedy, they have been at the heart of campaigning through their bravery, through their courage for better reform to the justice system. And the bill that we have introduced, I think it's fair to say, by any objective measure, is bold, it's ambitious, probably the biggest change that we will see in our justice system if the bill is passed in decades, some might even say longer than that.
There's broad support for the proposals, but the one aspect of the bill that's likely to be more controversial is a proposal to pilot juryless, judge-only trials in rape cases. That's been greeted by a bit more caution from opposition parties and by outright opposition from some in the legal sector.
Jenny, earlier we heard MPs in Westminster debating the illegal migration bill, but that was also discussed at Holyrood too, wasn't it?
Yes, of course, that's been a major focus at Westminster this week, but as you say, also discussed here at Holyrood. And part of the discussion and the debate was about whether it even should be debated at Holyrood, whether that was a relevant issue for MSPs to be discussing. Now, Social Justice Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville said the bill would have an impact on the duties of the Scottish Government and Scottish councils in relation to things like support for victims of human trafficking and for looked after children. She said that the Scottish Government should have at least been consulted on the legislation, but Donald Cameron for the Scottish Conservatives said it was a wholly reserved matter and wasn't even something that they should have been debating.
We have seen the SNP government this week accusing others of disrespecting devolution, but that takes some brass neck with respect when we are today debating we're debating an issue that is entirely reserved to the UK Parliament. We could instead be debating why, under this government, A&E waiting times hit their worst level on record, or why cancer waiting times are their longest on record. We could instead be debating why the education attainment gap has widened, not narrowed.
Cabinet Secretary. I wonder what Donald Cameron thinks of the fact that the Scottish Government was not aware and not given any previous warning of what was in this bill until it was actually published, and one deed before. Now, if we're talking about showing contempt for the Scottish Government, or more importantly, I think, the Scottish Parliament, which has the right to debate any subject it so chooses in the interests of the people of Scotland. And I think the people of Scotland care about how we care about the most vulnerable in our society.
And that's another example of the wrangling we've seen quite a lot recently between the Scottish and UK governments over mutual respect and where the line is drawn between devolved and reserved issues.
Thank you, Jenny. Jenny Davison there, reporting from Holyrood. Well, let's return to events here at Westminster and talk to Sean Curran. Sean, we've heard a lot recently about people struggling to find an NHS dentist, haven't we? And that's something that was discussed by the Health Select Committee this week.
Yes, that's right. It's a big issue. It's been discussed a lot. There's been a debate about it in the Commons this week. The Prime Minister was asked about it at Prime Minister's Questions. Now, you might remember that last year, the BBC, in an investigation, discovered that 9 out of 10 dentists were not taking on adult patients as NHS patients, and 8 out of 10 weren't willing to take on children as NHS patients. So this is something that Conservative MPs, Labour MPs, all parties have got an interest in because it's their constituents that are affected. The Health Committee heard this week from health officials and a minister, and they heard more calls for the system to be changed.
What proportion of the issues raised with you about health in Lincolnshire relate to NHS dentistry?
The greatest proportion, right from sort of maybe 2014-15, we've heard more about dental and access to NHS dental services than any other issue that our Health Watch has ever heard. It's really significant for us, and it's daily. We hear from people daily about it, and mostly asking us to help them find a dentist. And I have a team that actually yesterday I talked to one of my team who said, I have palpitations now when people ring up and say, can you help me find an NHS dentist, because I know that I can't help them and there's nothing I can say or do other than sort of signpost them to possibly NHS practices that might put them on a waiting list, and that's the best that we can offer.
What is your ambition? What is your offer?
My ambition is to get back to a good level of provision and to do quite a thorough overhaul of the contract and the current system, because I think that is what is needed now. We're not into small tweaks. We're prepared to work in an incremental way, but the system does need quite a lot of overhaul.
We want to know how many people are able to access an NHS dentist when they need it. Mm-hmm. And you said the government's ambition is for everybody to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Now, the information we were given at the last meeting was that roughly half, slightly less, right, of the population can do that at the moment. So I'm absolutely welcoming the government's commitment to achieve that. When do you anticipate to get there?
It's about how far you have to go, right? So it's no good to say, oh, well, you could access an NHS dentist if you're prepared to drive umpteen miles. So one of the things we are thinking about as we work on our dentistry plan, as we think about how we make interventions, in particular interventions to improve matters where access is clearly worse. There are some places that I think are struggling on a bunch of different measures.
There certainly are areas which are worse. We talk about dental deserts. Most of the rest of the country are just kind of barren ground. There are no green pastures, are there? Because every MP is reporting constituents coming to us saying they simply cannot get an NHS dentist. Now, you've set out an ambition today that the government wants to ensure that everybody has access to an NHS dentist. My question is, when do you intend to achieve that by?
Yeah, well, as soon as possible is the only possible answer to that question.
An issue that's suddenly getting a lot of focus there. Thanks very much, Sean. More from you shortly. But to Cardiff now, and our Wales political correspondent, Rodri Lewis. Rodri, the Welsh Government has apologised officially to mothers who were forced to give up their babies for adoption.
Yes, that's right. Thousands of unmarried mothers all over the UK were forced to give away their babies over a period of around 30 years, beginning in the 1950s, mainly because of the stigma attached to it at the time, including in Wales, of course. Now, the Scottish Government has already apologised, and this week the Welsh Government did the same.
At the time when these adoptions took place, many of the women were young, vulnerable, and experiencing personal crises. They were not always informed of any legal rights to look after their child themselves or provided with the help that they needed to do so. Some were made to feel inadequate, immoral and undeserving when it came to raising their own babies. Adoption was put forward as the only option because of a lack of financial and other support and the stigma associated with illegitimacy and motherhood out of wedlock. And even now, many of those affected find it extremely difficult to open up and talk about the lifelong heartbreak they've kept to themselves for fear of still being judged.
And there was a group of women and adult children who'd been affected by all of this, listening from the public gallery, and they were very moved by what they heard. And now there's pressure from campaigners for the UK government to make a similar apology.
And moving on to First Minister's questions, Rodri, the First Minister was accused of misleading the Senedd.
Yes, Plaid Cymru say there are questions over a decision to put Wales's biggest health board, Betsy Cadwaladr, into special measures. Now, the party leader, Adam Price, says the First Minister told MSs that the Auditor-General, who does have a role in this process, had said Betsy should leave special measures. But the Auditor-General, Adrian Crompton, denies this, and it's all part of a procedure which happened 3 years ago involving what's known as the tripartite group.
Your statement, First Minister, and that of your ministerial colleague at the time, gave the impression that there was an universally shared view around the tripartite table. But the Auditor-General tells us that, on the contrary, at the meeting of the tripartite group on the 13th of November 2020, and I'm quoting now, differing views were expressed on whether the health board should stay in special measures. Will you publish the notes of that meeting? Can you confirm that ministers were made aware of the Auditor-General's letter? And can you also confirm that the Auditor-General has written to the Welsh Government on several other occasions to raise similar concerns?
So what I can say to members is this. It is no surprise, of course, that differing views are expressed in such a meeting. That's why a meeting is called, in order to make sure that those different perspectives are all available. But the advice that goes to ministers, let me make clear to members again, does not come directly from the tripartite meeting. It comes in a second and separate stage from civil servants. That is the advice that ministers see. That is the advice that ministers draw on. But in the end, it is ministers in that third stage who make the decision. That is what happened in 2020. It's what happens every time the tripartite system gets together, does that twice a year. The system operates as I've just explained. I don't think I could be clearer.
But the First Minister evidently felt he did have to make things clearer, as he's now released a letter saying that Audit Wales didn't and doesn't advise ministers directly on matters like this, a move Plaid Cymru has described as a humiliating climb down.
And Rodri, there was cross-party support for bringing HS2 money to Wales. What was that about?
Well, this has long been a bone of contention, of course, that the UK government says that HS2 is an England and Wales project, so Wales won't get any extra money under the Barnett formula, thought to be worth around £5 billion. Now, the problem is not a single part of HS2 runs through Wales, but the UK government says that Wales will benefit from it. And now there's cross-party support here at the Senedd for the call for Wales to get that extra funding, including from the Welsh Conservatives. But first, let's hear from Plaid Cymru.
As a Senedd, we should unite and demand that the UK government redesignates HS2 as an England-only project, thus providing Wales with essential consequential funding. Funding that could be used to repair and modernise our broken railway network. It could be used to connect our communities, making travel more accessible, affordable and sustainable. It is a well-known fact that our railways are outdated and underfunded, resulted in slower services, poor connections and inadequate capacity. And the Deputy Minister was honest about this recently. But with this funding, we could significantly improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our rail system.
Now, let me be clear. It's the Welsh Conservative view that Wales should receive consequentials as a result of HS2. However, and let me please emphasise this however, there's an important point which I must stress. We don't want to see a single penny go directly into the hands of this Labour government. And let me explain why. Any money coming to Wales should go directly to Network Rail, because we have absolutely no confidence this government will spend the money wisely to deliver major infrastructure projects. I've shared my view on this matter on countless occasions, and I will say it again today. Labour in Wales have a horrendous track record of frittering away millions of pounds of taxpayers' cash on their vanity projects.
Now, responding to what was said, the Minister said that the current situation was a scandal. But the Welsh Conservatives are meeting for their annual spring conference this weekend, just down the road in Newport. So it should make for some interesting conversations with their UK counterparts.
Indeed. Look, thank you, Rodri. Rodri Lewis there at the Senedd. Well, let's come back to events here at Westminster and catch up with Sean Curran. Sean, on Tuesday, there was what's called an Opposition Day debate on water quality. What was that about?
This is when Labour gets to decide what the subject of the debate is. This was another long-running issue. This is about sewage discharges into rivers, beaches and waterways. And there's been a very long-running row about this, and it's obviously a very big issue, and it's an issue that has been used as a campaigning issue before. And Labour were trying to do a number of things with this debate. Obviously, they wanted to talk about the issue, but they also wanted to have a situation which they'd found pretty effective last year when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, of bringing forward a motion and then forcing Conservative MPs to vote against it. So they could then say, you voted against our motion to tackle this problem. They also wanted to do something else a little bit more complicated. They wanted to take over the order paper of the House of Commons, something that's got echoes of what happened during the Brexit debates, so that they could introduce their own bill to tackle the problem. Well, on the morning of the debate, the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey, announced that water companies in England and Wales would face legally binding targets in order to clear up the sewage discharge. So the scene was set, really, for a rather lively debate.
The reason we're here today is because the country we love and the quality of life for millions of working people is being treated with utter contempt. Dumped on with raw human sewage, dumped on an industrial scale, and dumped on with at least 1.5 million sewage dumps last year alone. Raw human sewage is even being discharged moments away from this very House of Parliament. Now think about that when members go to vote. There is no place exempt from the Tory sewage scandal. And what a metaphor for the last 13 years of a Tory government.
The honourable gentleman has made the absolute fatal error of thinking that we are supporting the water companies. We are holding them to account, which is exactly why we have threatened them with unlimited fines. It is exactly why Ofwat has passed new rules to restrict the dividend payments. It is exactly why we now have the most stringent measures in Europe on water companies.
Not one English river is classed as being in healthy conditions. None meet good chemical standards. Few meet good ecological standards, and they have been in power for 13 years. That is a record of failure.
The Honourable Lady should be aware, of course, that during our time in the last decade, we put into place legislation that made it tougher to meet ecological status. That includes taking on the monitoring of certain chemicals, which isn't done by the Welsh or Scottish governments. And that's why we'll continue to work on this in quite a specific way. But what I will say to her is that we are absolutely leaning into this issue. You know, we knew, I genuinely wish they'd started to sort out the issues while they were in office. I'm not saying they did completely nothing, but they certainly weren't being clear with the public on what was going on.
This is the first government to tackle this issue for many decades. Does Secretary of State agree with me that the Labour Minister was talking poo?
The truth is that privatisation of our water industry was wrong. It's been a complete failure for the British public. So if we're serious about tackling this ecological disaster, we do need to support the opposition's motion today. But ultimately, we need to have a serious discussion about bringing our water industry into public ownership for the public good.
I would just gently say to the opposition, this politically motivated, politically timed debate today on a highly emotive subject is not a neutral act. It overflows beyond this chamber, as myself and other colleagues on the side who have had to have police come to our homes and offices to make sure that we are safe as a result of misinformation on sewage. No, it has impacted our families and our staff.
We say or we hear the government talking about the polluter should pay. Yes, the polluter pays. The polluter pays themselves massive, massive bonuses. And that is why we are outraged in Cumbria and across this country. Because it's not just the biodiversity threat to our lakes and rivers, the threat to fish stocks, to those who swim, to our pets that use our waterways, to the tourism economy that it underpins in the Lake District in particular, but because of a sense of deep injustice that large corporations rake in enormous profits while this government does nothing to stop them pumping sewage into those waterways that we value so dearly in Cumbria and elsewhere.
Now, Sean, there was a vote at the end of that debate, but it was all very, very complicated. Can you explain briefly what happened?
This was a great parliamentary moment. The government had brought forward an amendment in which they basically took away the proposal for Labour to have time to introduce its own bill. Now, because they were taking away part of Labour's motion, meant MPs had to vote on that amendment first, which they duly did. The government has a majority. They won. That left the rest of Labour's motion calling for the government to do certain things, and then there was a vote on that. But Labour ended up abstaining because, of course, they had lost the bit that they wanted, which was the opportunity to introduce their own bill. So, in the end, Labour had to abstain on what was essentially half, maybe three-quarters of their own motion.
High drama. Well explained, Sean. And just before we go, the sad news that former Strictly Come Dancing judge Len Goodman died this week, and MPs paid tribute to him in the Commons.
Yes, Parliament's always had a fondness for Strictly Come Dancing. Lots of senior politicians have appeared on the show as contestants. We had the Department for Work and Pensions questions this week, and it turned out that Len Goodman had a connection with the department.
The pension credit video that he filmed with me last summer for the annual Pension Credit Awareness Day in June was the most successful piece of comms we've ever done on this issue and massively boosted pension credit applications. Throughout the day's filming, I can tell the House he was kind, immensely professional, totally polite and a delight to work with, and still had all the dance moves, even at his age. He will be very sadly missed by this House and by his many fans around the country, and our thoughts, prayers and condolences go out to his family.
Guy Opperman, remembering Len Goodman. Sean, thank you very much indeed. That's all for Politics UK for this week. Joe Coburn will be back with Politics Live on Tuesday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer.